Welcome to SAM Conversation, a video program of South Asia Monitor. I am Tarun Basu, and I am in conversation with Barry O'Farrell, Australia's High Commissioner to India, and Amit Dasgupta, a former Indian diplomat who's now a strategic advisor to UNSW Sydney, one of Australia's top universities and a big draw for Indian students. We are going to talk today about India-Australia relations and the future of the relationship in the years to come. And it's, I hope I'm not wrong, but I think it's almost a year to this day, or just exactly a year to this day, when the appointment of Ambassador High Commissioner Barry O'Farrell was announced in Canberra. And he has been here for about a year now. And India-Australia relations have really gone from strength to strength. And arguably, the relationship is probably at their best ever. There's nothing better to illustrate the trajectory of the relationship than this article that Prime Minister Scott Morrison recently wrote on the National Day of both India and Australia in one of the Indian papers, the Times of India, I think, where he talked about the distance which separates us is being steadily diminished. He talked about the two being natural partners and called it, I think, it may not be the exact words, the pivotal moment in our friendship. The two countries signed a comprehensive strategic partnership at their first virtual summit, I think last June. There was also this very, very seminal mutual logistics support agreement. There's this shared vision for maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, which has great strategic significance. There was a decision to elevate the 2+2 dialogue to ministerial level. There was this agreement on minerals and rare earth, which I think is very, very important for India in the light of its earlier over-dependence on China for this. And of course, going beyond the 3 C's, Commonwealth, cricket, and curry, there are the high-tech agreement. The Prime Minister Scott Morrison spoke to the Bangalore Tech Summit some months ago. And then, of course, there are this growing collaboration in higher education. Then there are these, another aspect of the relationship is growing number of Indians in Australia, about 700,000 Indians. And I think, if I'm not wrong, about 38,000 Indians got citizenship last year, which is the largest number from any country which got citizenship. So there's so many different aspects to this relationship, and nobody better to talk about this than High Commissioner O'Farrell, who has been here now just about less than a year. And I think the relationship, as we talked about, is going from strength to strength. So High Commissioner Farrell would be very happy to get your perspective now that you're here and you had a range of discussions on this. How do you see the relationship and how do you see the trajectory in the months and years to come?
Well, Tarun, I think given the year that the world has had, Australia and India should be very satisfied with the progress they've made with their bilateral relationship, which, as you said, in June was elevated to a comprehensive strategic partnership. And I think it's been a long time in the making, but I think a combination of political leadership, a combination of geopolitical issues within our region, as well as the COVID pandemic, has seen it come together in a way that in the past we always seem to have one or two threads unraveling. I think the big lesson of the COVID year, the upside of the pandemic, if you like, is the importance of trusted friends and supply lines. That's clearly been a factor. I think the geopolitical situation speaks for itself, but something you touched on in the introduction, which is the increasingly large diaspora in Australia, that living bridge that President Coven talked about between our two countries, has also had an impact in opening the eyes of people in Australia to the opportunities that exist in India. And I think all of those things have delivered, in what I said again, and what the world knows to have been a very difficult year, a great outcome between our two countries.
High Commissioner, if I might jump in over here and ask you two related questions. One is that there's an extraordinary friendship, a sort of chemistry that Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Scott Morrison enjoy. And much of this is also centered around shared concerns. And this being the year of the ox, I should say that there is this big ox in the room. And I wanted to ask you for your thoughts on how you see the Quad developing, how you see the 2+2, which we are told is likely to take place over the next few months, the issues of concern that both Australia and India can jointly address, and whether you feel these would add as building blocks to the relationship.
I start where I finished my last answer, which is that the people-to-people links are extraordinary. I also think, Amit, the fact that whilst India's had one Prime Minister since 2014, Australia's had three, hasn't helped relationships. But what we now have is a Prime Minister in Australia, who's committed to the relationship, who's working hard at the relationship. And of course, Prime Minister Modi has been incredibly generous to each of the Prime Ministers that Australia's had. But there's no doubt, as we know in life, constancy in relationships, the same personnel relationships, helps to further trust that can add greater depth and breadth to any relationship. So I think political leadership in these matters is important. And I think the fact is that, again, over the past 12 months or for the past 2 years, we've seen a greater effort by the Australian political leadership towards India, which is something that I think has been welcomed by the Indian side. You're also right, though, that I've always said in the past as a former state leader that the defence and strategic relationship between India and Australia was always the strongest leg of the chair. What we've been seeing more recently is greater weight being given to the other legs of the chair. So whether it's the Quad and the increasing use of the Quad as a positive vehicle and vision for our region, still respecting the centrality of ASEAN, but the Quad has come into its own in a year in which all of our countries in this region have been cooperating closely in relation to COVID, but it hasn't stopped those countries within the Quad also talking about the other challenges and potential solutions to those challenges that they face. Equally, Ahmed, I'm talking to a former ambassador who comes from the Foreign Service of India, where your Foreign Secretary or Foreign Minister has invented this term that I'd never heard of until I took up my post here a year ago, plurilateralism, where countries are reaching out to other countries on shared interests where there is mutual benefit. And of course, the biggest benefit and shared interest between Australia and India is that Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific region. It is our neighbourhood. We both have shared commitments to ensure that it is free and open. Your Prime Minister described that during the virtual summit as a sacred duty. It's a duty and a responsibility that Australia happily has embraced. And why wouldn't they, given the importance of the region to the economic development of both our countries? So I think for all those reasons, we're going to only see the trajectory go in one direction, and that is closer cooperation. There's talk of a Quad leaders meeting. There's talk of greater depth in what we'll be doing through the Quad. There are issues for others, not for me to comment on. But I think whether it's in the strategic section, whether it's in the economic and trade areas where we've committed to again press for a free trade agreement between our countries, but where in the meantime we're seeing progress made with increased exports and imports from each of our countries to the other, including investment from Australia into India. or whether it's those people-to-people links that cover not just migration and employment, but also think tanks, the arts, and all those things that give depth to any society and that continue to give depth to the societies of India and Australia.
High Commissioner, when Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Morrison spoke at the virtual summit last year, I remember Prime Minister Modi talking about it later as an outstanding discussion. And that was the first virtual summit that Prime Minister Modi had with any world leader, and subsequently had with a lot of others. One of the issues, of course, was the cooperation on COVID. And there was this decision to set up this Australia-India strategic research fund. And I think Australia set aside $4 million for it in terms of more research, in terms of diagnostic equipment and post-COVID recovery, all that. So in the light of that, now both our countries are coming out of the shadow of COVID, although it lingers in certain places. How important do you think was this agreement on COVID cooperation, if I might put it that way?
I think it's ironic that a pandemic, something that has devastated the world, has also had some positive benefits. And as you say, and as I mentioned before, the fact that our foreign secretaries, for instance, during the worst of the pandemic, were talking almost on a weekly basis with each other and with their colleagues across the region, including the United States, Japan, North Korea, Vietnam, New Zealand, and other like-minded countries, about the shared challenges they were facing, about the way in which each was trying to deal with the pandemic, develops a relationship. It develops trust. It develops a recognition in each country and each person of what the other can bring to the discussion. And I think that's what we've seen in relation to the bilateral relationship. But can I say this, that I have been impressed. As I said, I arrived 4 weeks before lockdown. I've watched the response in India with growing admiration. I've been delighted that the death rate here has been historically low compared to the rest of the world, and that you're now on the way out of this crisis. But I also watched with great interest what you did for the region, the outreach that you did for the region initially with pharmaceuticals, with PPE, with medical teams, what you continue to do today, not just in this region, but to friends across the world in relation to vaccine diplomacy, is incredibly impressive. So it's another demonstration of India emerging as a world leader, exercising influence and goodwill across not just its region, but the globe. But what you've been doing in your region, Australia has sought to also do in the Pacific region. So, you know, we've come to the same conclusion, we've adopted the same practices, but from different positions. And when you look at it from afar, you see the similarities. So I'm incredibly optimistic about the relationship, because whether it's the shared values, whether it's the shared approach to trying to get things done, which is not always by conflict, but by trying to find a way through, and whether it's our generosity of spirit as nations in seeking to assist those around us, and whether it's our joint support for the Gavi Fund on vaccines, whether it was the unscripted statements of both our Prime Ministers of the United Nations General Assembly, where both of them argued very strongly, but without touching base with each other, for an equitable distribution of vaccines to all people around the world, particularly those countries that would struggle otherwise. I think it's just a sign of the increasing closeness between both our countries.
High Commissioner, do you see this as a shifting of mindsets in both countries? Tarun talked about the 3 C's, and I remember during my tenure in Sydney, I used to talk about the 3 E's, the economy, education, and energy. And you've been on record talking about the 4 D's. And I was wondering if you'd like to elaborate on this, purely because, and I'm not being facetious, purely because I think a change of vocabulary, a shifting in vocabulary, also heralds a shifting in mindsets. You know, people in India would normally say, oh, Australia is very, very far away, or that it has 23 million people and that's not a very large market. Are you seeing a significant tectonic shift taking place?
I do think there's been a tectonic shift, and the 2 countries have have got closer together, just as a very long time ago, we separated in geomorphic terms. But I agree with you, Amit, that the use of language can be important in summing up where a relationship's at. And of course, the original letters and used around Australia, India was 3 Cs: so cricket, Commonwealth, and current. And I dismiss neither of those concepts, particularly cricket, which continues to be a strong relationship between both our countries. And as our Prime Minister said, we can be fierce competitors on the field, but equally good friends and close cooperators off the field. And that's the spirit of cricket, if you like. So I wouldn't dismiss those. I like yours: economy, energy, and education. And clearly today, education is as important as ever. And so what I tried to do when I arrived shortly before the virtual Leaders Summit took place was to try and sum up where I thought we were at. And that was using the 4 Ds. And that was democracy, which of course is the first D, which speaks to our common institutional heritage, our democratic system, and our respect for the rule of law. Defence, of course, refers to the shared vision we have for open, prosperous and stable Indo-Pacific. Diaspora, of course, touches on the people-to-people ties, which, as I said, President Coburn described as a living bridge between our 2 countries. And the final D, Dorsty, or what I would always interpret as mateship in Australian parliaments, underlines that sense of friendship, of seeing one another as trusted, reliable partners and friends. And as Prime Minister Morrison would add, fierce competitors on the cricket pitch. I think those things are important, and I think it does reflect the maturing of the relationship in the fact that, Australia is a multicultural, cosmopolitan, highly developed Indo-Pacific society with an independent vision for the region and its place in it. And India's come of age. It's a great power awakening, testing its strength with high rates of economic growth, vast and young demographics, and a hunger for economic development. And it brings, as I continue to say, to its multilateral engagement, a humanity that hasn't always been seen when these organisations have been led by people from what used to be called the First World.
Thank you, High Commissioner. I just wanted to pick up on a point that both you and Tarun went into some depth and discussion, which is the pandemic. And I know that a number of people will be watching this interview, and many of them would be international students. Now, Australia has emerged as a significant, almost preferred education destination for students seeking quality higher education. And very rightly so, because of the very large number of Australian universities which are in the top 100 and including those which are in the top 50. And cutting across the length and breadth of the education verticals, whether it's engineering or the business school, medicine or science, architecture or law, and arts and humanities or design. Now, the question that comes to mind really is, how do you see the lockdown? Because a very large number of students are unable to go to Australia to pick up their studies and are forced to consider online education, which is causing a certain amount of frustration purely because they have to pay the same tuition fees as they would for face-to-face. Do you see Australia opening its borders in the near term, or do you feel that because of the different varieties which are now being discovered, Brazil, South Africa, the United Kingdom, that there could be a lag?
Amit, whatever frustration I know Indian students in India who want to come to Australia feel, I can assure them that it is shared by me. And I suggest that your latter statement is probably closer to the truth. The biggest frustration I have as High Commissioner to India is that I still have thousands of Australian citizens in India who want to go home. And India, like Australia, is a federation. And as a result of decisions at a state level in Australia, the numbers of people we can get into Australia are currently restricted. And obviously, as any government would do, as the Indian government has sought to do with its Vande Bharat flights, a priority is being given to returning citizens to the country. Now, when and if the states increase the number of people that can come into their cities, go into the quarantine and come out the other end and engage in full activities in Australia, we will see improvements. But it is disturbing. It is disturbing that we're seeing new strains of the virus. As you know, we've just come through one in the state of Victoria, which happily, as of speaking today, seems to have been put to bed. Happily too, Australia is about to have the vaccine rollout start at the end of this month. But in the meantime, I know that universities, I know that other people are working overtime to try and ensure that the system is ready to go if and when it is safe to bring people other than Australian citizens back into the country. As I say, my frustration is with both the education situation, but also with those citizens I'm trying to return from India. But I do know, having spoken to a number of the students who are desperate to get to Australia, that it is frustrating. But I would make this point, that their online learning does count to the degree. Their online learning does still enable them, when they do return to Australia, to embark on those post-visa work rights that is always part of the process of an education in Australia. And equally, when they do get to Australia, it will be seen to be the safe, supportive country that they would expect. Not only safe in a COVID sense, but one of the great benefits, Amit, of the increasing Indian diaspora in Australia is that, as we've seen in bushfires, as we've seen during COVID, the Indian community is the first to come forward to assist, particularly to support the volunteers, and they've done that not just within their own communities, but across the broader Australian community. So I think that when we get through this disease at the right time, those students will be welcomed with open arms, will get a great education in Australia, and will go a long way to furthering improving the relationship between both our countries.
The fact that this pandemic, like terrorism, knows no borders. And unless you control it, you can't just be welcoming to everyone, and you need to be very, very careful. So I'm mindful of the difficult situation that High Commissioners have, and but I needed to ask that question because I do know many would be interested. But as Tarun says, you can't have a conversation with High Commissioner Barry O'Farrell, who's also known to be a cricket tragic, without bringing the subject of cricket. And I'd like to request Barry to speak a little bit about a conversation he and I had during my tenure as the Consul General. This was the Sydney Test. And that series was a terrible series for India. I think India lost 5-0. But it was also the last series in which you had the greats like Rahul Dravid and VVS Lakshman, Sehwag and Sachin Tendulkar playing. And in the Sydney Test, just before lunch, Tendulkar was an 85 not out. And that everyone thought was going to be his 100th. And I still remember Barry High Commissioner was in office, and he decided to go to the Sydney cricket grounds. High Commissioner, would you like to take it from there and tell us the rest of the story?
So I'd been to, my average summer when I was Chief Minister was to attend the first 3 days of the Test match. And I'd been to the first 3 days, and on the fourth day, Sachin was, as you say, on that score. And I asked my office to let me know when he got to 80. And I jumped in the car, and I was only 5 minutes away from the ground. And as my car came into the ground, as it pulled up, even without winding the windows down, I could hear the most almighty roar from the crowd. And I knew precisely what had happened. I walked upstairs into the trust box where you and others were. I said to the chairman of the trust, I was going to come and watch the century. I just wanted you to know that I came. I'm now leaving because I couldn't watch any more cricket. I had hoped that he would score his 100th Test match at one of his favourite grounds, the Sydney Cricket Ground. But I'm delighted, Amit, to say that I still have the photo of the membership of the SCG that I gave him to celebrate that test match. So it was his last test at the SCG. It was a great occasion. And I think that speaks to the relationship between Australians and Indians. We can talk about these things, we can compete vigorously, and we can share great memories. And I have said for some time that I think Australia views the Border Gavaskar Trophy Series with greater passion than they do the Ashes series these days, because India brings greater excitement, greater passion, and greater skill to the game. And at times, as we saw in Adelaide, some really strange things happen. And my story that I will recount when I'm back in Australia, Amit, is sitting through a meeting with Gaurav Ganguly in Calcutta, watching that collapse in Adelaide. And this was my first meeting with him, chairman of the BCCI. I wasn't sure it was the way to forge a strong relationship, but he was very restrained, can I say.
You know, once you start talking about cricket, you cannot stop, but I guess we have a time limitation here. And I think we should reserve one slot only with the High Commissioner to just talk about cricket. And that we'll leave for another day, another time. And thank you very much, High Commissioner. I think we had an excellent discussion, and we really covered a wide gamut of areas. The prospects of India-Australia relations really look bright. And this is just the start of the year, and we hope we can continue these kind of discussions more through the year. So thank you once again for your time, and thank you, Amit.
Thank you, Tarun. And perhaps I can suggest that Amit and I do a series on our favourite cricketers from each other's country.
Yes.
Who knows, in cricket season, we might even get an audience for it.